The darkest chapters of criminal history are often written by the very predators who were too arrogant to stay silent, forcing us to explore their macabre games through the redacted shadows of what we are actually permitted to show you. Behind every taunting letter and staged interview lies a fatal flaw of ego that inevitably transforms the hunter into the hunted. It's beginning with a phantom who paralyzed New York City through the tip of a pen. In the summer of 1976, New York City was already a metropolis buckling under the immense pressure of severe economic stagnation, widespread municipal strikes, and a palpable sense of urban decay that permeated every borough. Amidst this chaotic backdrop, the ordinary citizens of the Bronx and Queens sought temporary refuge from the sweltering heat waves by enjoying late-night conversations in parked vehicles or taking quiet evening walks through their residential neighborhoods. These mundane, everyday activities, previously considered safe within the familiar confines of local communities, were suddenly transformed into scenes of unimaginable horror when an unidentified assailant began hunting young men and women. The terror commenced on a seemingly unremarkable July night when Donna Loria and Jody Valenti were sitting in a parked Oldsmobile, completely unaware that the shadows outside their vehicle harbored a lethal threat. Without warning, the deafening roar of a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver shattered the midnight silence, claiming the life of 18-year-old Donna and severely wounding her friend Jody in an unprovoked, senseless act of violence. This initial strike appeared to investigators as a tragic but isolated incident, perhaps a localized dispute or a random act of street violence, rather than the opening salvo of a prolonged serial campaign. The detectives assigned to the early investigations meticulously combed the crime scenes for traditional motives, interviewing countless associates and family members in search of disgruntled ex-lovers or financial disputes. However, the total absence of any personal connection between the perpetrator and the victims left the New York Police Department grappling with a phantom who struck without apparent reason or predictable pattern. Young women with long dark hair, simply trying to navigate the social landscape of the 1970s, unwittingly became the primary targets of a predator who blended seamlessly into the massive population of the city. The fundamental illusion of safety in the outer boroughs was irrevocably shattered, setting the stage for a period of unprecedented public hysteria and a law enforcement mobilization that would soon consume the entire region. The trajectory of the investigation shifted dramatically and irreversibly in April of 1977, marking the precise moment the silent predator decided that merely claiming lives was insufficient for his growing ego. Following the brutal double murder of Valentina Suriani and Alexander Asau in the Bronx, responding officers discovered a meticulously handwritten letter left deliberately near the crime scene, addressed directly to NYPD Captain Joseph Borelli. This physical piece of evidence transformed the completely anonymous assailant into a boastful correspondent who actively mocked the police department's inability to halt his ongoing reign of terror. Within the sprawling, rambling text of this now infamous document, the killer formally christened himself with the moniker Son of Sam, a chilling pseudonym that would rapidly dominate global newspaper headlines. The letter was saturated with bizarre pseudo-demonic imagery and explicit taunts, declaring his insatiable thirst for violence and mocking the detectives who were working exhaustively to decipher his twisted psychology. By directly establishing communication, the perpetrator elevated his crimes from a series of random shootings to a highly publicized game of cat and mouse, weaponizing the media to amplify his psychological grip on the city. The NYPD recognized that they were no longer simply tracking a disorganized murderer, but rather a calculated individual who craved widespread recognition and derived immense pleasure from the public's mounting panic. This inciting incident forced a radical restructuring of the investigative approach, leading to the creation of the Omega Task Force, a massive coalition of detectives dedicated exclusively to capturing the elusive .44 caliber killer. The letter itself provided a terrifying glimpse into a highly disturbed mind, offering cryptic clues and deliberate misdirections that severely complicated the already staggering logistical challenge of securing the city's vast nighttime landscape. From this singular moment of arrogant communication forward, the killer's need for an audience became the defining characteristic of the manhunt, fundamentally altering how law enforcement interacted with the press and the public during active serial investigations. As the sweltering summer of 1977 approached, the tension within New York City reached a boiling point, fueled by the killer's escalating audacity and his expanding correspondence with high-profile media figures. In a calculated maneuver designed to maximize his exposure, the son of Sam forwarded a deeply disturbing, disjointed letter to Jimmy Breslin, a prominent columnist for the New York Daily News. Breslin's decision to publish heavily redacted excerpts of this correspondence effectively gave the murderer the massive platform he desperately sought, triggering a surge of terrifying letters from copycats and further complicating the legitimate investigation. The psychological warfare waged through these public taunts caused an unprecedented level of civilian panic, prompting thousands of women throughout the metropolitan area to drastically alter their appearances by cutting their long, dark hair or purchasing light, colored wigs. The Omega Task Force, operating under crushing political and public pressure, pursued tens of thousands of leads, interviewing countless suspects and investigating anyone who had ever purchased a .44 caliber Bulldog revolver in the United States. Despite their relentless efforts, the police found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by the Phantom, chasing down endless false sightings and dead end tips generated by a terrified populace overly eager to identify their neighbors as the culprit. The killer continued to strike with terrifying precision, leaving a trail of devastation that ultimately included 6 fatalities and 7 severe injuries, while his mocking letters continually reminded the authorities of their perceived incompetence. However, the very arrogance that compelled him to taunt the police and the press simultaneously planted the seeds of his inevitable destruction, as his increasing comfort led to critical lapses in his previously disciplined operational security. Detectives painstakingly analyzed the linguistic patterns, the peculiar phrasing, and the psychological undertones of his letters, attempting to construct a viable profile of a heavily isolated, deeply resentful individual who functioned well enough to maintain employment. The relentless escalation of his media game required him to take increasingly reckless risks, moving outside his established geographic comfort zones and inadvertently leaving behind the mundane, bureaucratic traces that would eventually expose his carefully guarded true identity. The climactic breakthrough in the largest manhunt in New York's history did not originate from a brilliant psychological deduction or a cinematic standoff, but rather from a remarkably mundane traffic violation that exposed the killer's human fallibility. During the tragic early morning hours of August 1977, following the fatal shooting of Stacy Moskowitz and the severe wounding of Robert Violante in Brooklyn, a local resident named Cecilia Davis provided detectives with a seemingly insignificant detail. She reported observing a suspicious man walking steadily toward a car parked near a fire hydrant, an action that had resulted in a routine parking summons being issued by an observant local patrol officer just moments before the gunfire erupted. Investigators cross-referenced all parking tickets issued in that specific Brooklyn sector during the precise time frame of the murder, a tedious bureaucratic exercise that ultimately highlighted a citation belonging to a yellow Ford Galaxy. This crucial piece of documentation was registered to a 24-year-old postal worker named David Berkowitz, residing in a chaotic, sparsely furnished apartment in Yonkers, far removed from the primary killing grounds. When detectives converged on Berkowitz's Yonkers address, they discovered the yellow Galaxy parked outside, clearly containing a high-capacity rifle ammunition and a duffel bag visible in the back seat, providing immediate, undeniable probable cause. Authorities established a tense perimeter around the building, patiently waiting for their suspect to emerge, rather than risking a highly dangerous tactical breach of the apartment complex. As Berkowitz finally exited his residence and approached the vehicle with a strange, detached smile on his face, detectives swiftly surrounded him with drawn weapons, demanding to know his true identity. Stripped of his terrifying anonymity and cornered by the very investigators he had so arrogantly mocked for over a year, The prolific murderer simply looked at the arresting officers and stated, "Well, you got me." The imposing facade of the demonic son of Sam instantly evaporated, revealing a deeply disturbed, profoundly unremarkable individual whose desperate need for historical notoriety had ultimately provided the exact municipal paperwork required to orchestrate his own downfall. Following his high-profile arrest, David Berkowitz rapidly dispensed with his fabricated tales of demonic possession and neighborhood dogs commanding him to kill, eventually pleading guilty to all 6 counts of second-degree murder. The judicial system swiftly processed his extensive crimes, culminating in a judge sentencing him to 6 consecutive life terms in the New York State correctional system, ensuring he would never again walk the streets as a free man. The sheer magnitude of his public notoriety and the immediate media scramble to purchase his exclusive life rights prompted the New York State Legislature to enact the unprecedented and historically significant Son of Sam laws. These crucial legal statutes were specifically designed and rapidly in criminals illegally prevented violent criminals publicity avoid their horrific offenses, fundamentally changing the true crime publishing industry. Throughout his decades of incarceration, Berkowitz has participated in numerous psychological evaluations and documentary interviews, consistently attempting to rebrand his public image from a notorious serial killer to an allegedly reformed spiritual counselor. Despite these highly publicized efforts at personal reinvention, the parole board has repeatedly and unequivocally denied his petitions for release, accurately citing the immense, irreversible destruction he inflicted upon the victims' families and the broader community. The historical legacy of the .44 caliber killer remains deeply rooted in his disastrous decision to break the silence of the shadows, proving that a murderer's narcissistic compulsion to boast is often their most fatal vulnerability. The exhaustive forensic analysis of his handwritten taunts established a permanent investigative blueprint for behavioral science units dealing with communicative predators who weaponize the postal service against law enforcement agencies. He remains securely confined within the heavily fortified walls of the Shawangunk Correctional Facility, completely isolated from the massive, vibrant city he once held hostage through his cowardly acts of violence and pathetic letters. Yet, this lethal intersection of overwhelming arrogance and the desperate compulsion to communicate with the authorities was not an anomaly confined to the crowded streets of New York, as a similarly silent phantom was simultaneously preparing to expose his own horrific secrets across the quiet, unsuspecting plains of the American Midwest. In the early months of 1974, Wichita, Kansas, was a quintessential Midwestern city characterized by quiet suburban neighborhoods, strong community bonds, and an overarching sense of security that allowed residents to routinely leave their doors unlocked. This fragile illusion of absolute safety was violently, irrevocably shattered when an invisible predator initiated a campaign of terror that would haunt the region for over 3 decades. On a freezing January morning, the devastating discovery of the Odero family, Joseph, Julie, and 2 of their young children, brutally murdered inside their own home, sent unprecedented shockwaves through the local law enforcement community. The sheer brutality of the crime scene, completely devoid of any forced entry or obvious financial motive, left seasoned detectives grappling with the terrifying reality of a highly organized, sadistic offender operating within their jurisdiction. Investigators meticulously combed the residence for viable physical evidence, but the perpetrator had operated with a chilling level of forensic discipline, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a paralyzed community. Unbeknownst to the terrified residents purchasing new deadbolts and security systems, the monster they feared was not a transient drifter hiding in the shadows, but a deeply embedded member of their own society. He was a dedicated husband, an attentive father, a prominent local church leader, and a municipal compliance officer who routinely interacted with the very people he secretly plotted to destroy. This terrifying duality allowed him to walk freely among his future victims, methodically stalking his prey while hiding behind an impenetrable facade of painfully ordinary, bureaucratic normalcy. The Phantom of Wichita was seamlessly integrated into the mundane fabric of suburban life, actively participating in Boy Scout leadership and citing neighbors for minor ordinance violations. It was precisely this perfectly constructed mask of societal respectability that afforded him the terrifying operational freedom to hunt with absolute impunity, entirely undetected by the largest police mobilization in the city's history. The defining trajectory of the investigation shifted from a frantic search for a silent ghost to a highly public psychological war when the killer's overwhelming arrogance compelled him to officially introduce himself to the world. Frustrated by the lack of direct public recognition for his masterpiece at the Otero residence, the murderer deliberately placed a detailed confession letter inside an engineering textbook at the Wichita Public Library in October of 1974. Within the meticulously drafted pages of this arrogant correspondence, he claimed absolute responsibility for the slaughter, provided distinct details only the perpetrator could know, and explicitly warned the authorities that he intended to strike again. He chillingly defined his own macabre brand by coining the acronym BTK, standing for Bind, Torture, Kill, a terrifying moniker that would instantly dominate newspaper headlines and television broadcasts across the nation. This unprompted communication instantly transformed the dynamic of the manhunt, elevating the killer from a localized threat to a highly publicized, communicative psychopath who actively craved the media spotlight. Over the subsequent years, he continued his horrific reign, claiming the lives of Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, and several others while constantly refining his methods of infiltration and control. Following each horrific event, he systematically dispatched chilling letters, complex word puzzles, and terrifying poems to local television stations like KKTV and the offices of the Wichita Eagle. These mocking communications were deliberately designed to humiliate the police department, demonstrating his perceived intellectual superiority and holding the entire metropolitan area in a state of perpetual, suffocating anxiety. The killer thrived on the immense psychological power derived from watching the authorities scramble to decipher his cryptic messages, weaponizing the local press to amplify his dominance over the population. Detectives were forced into an agonizing game of cat and mouse, meticulously analyzing every handwritten syllable for a fatal slip-up while the arrogant predator watched their televised press conferences from the comfort of his suburban living room. Following his final confirmed murder in 1991, an eerie, unsettling silence descended upon the city of Wichita, leaving the cold case detectives chasing agonizingly stale leads and fading memories. For more than a decade, the taunting letters completely ceased, leading law enforcement and criminal profilers to logically theorize that the notorious BTK killer was either dead, permanently incarcerated for an unrelated crime, or institutionalized. However, the fragile, deeply inflated ego of a narcissistic predator fundamentally cannot tolerate the indignity of being forgotten, dismissed, or relegated to the dusty archives of unsolved local history. In early 2004, the Wichita Eagle published a comprehensive 30th anniversary retrospective article regarding the original Otero murders, openly questioning whether the infamous Phantom had simply faded away into obscurity. Deeply insulted by the public insinuation that his terrifying legacy was diminishing, the killer's insatiable hunger for relevance overrode his decades of disciplined operational security, prompting a catastrophic resumption of communication. He rapidly dispatched a series of complex packages containing heavily bound documents, elaborate word puzzles, and a pristine cereal box left meticulously in a local park to prove his continued existence. These disturbing parcels contained chilling, undeniable souvenirs taken directly from the historic crime scenes, including the driver's licenses of his victims, instantly reigniting the massive, dormant manhunt with unprecedented urgency. This renewed barrage of taunts forced the Wichita Police Department to form a modern, technologically advanced task force, utilizing forensic tools that simply did not exist during his original killing spree. In a fatal miscalculation born of supreme technological arrogance, the killer utilized a newspaper classified ad to ask the police a direct, seemingly innocuous question. Could a floppy disk be traced to a specific computer? In a brilliant stroke of psychological manipulation, investigators placed a coded response in the newspaper falsely assuring him that the digital format was entirely secure, perfectly setting the technological trap that would end his reign. The culmination of a 30-year nightmare arrived in February of 2005, not through a dramatic shootout or a bloody crime scene, but via a remarkably mundane piece of obsolete office technology. A padded envelope containing a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk was delivered to the local KSS-TV affiliate, which immediately transferred the vital evidence to the expectant cyber crimes division of the police department. Law enforcement computer forensics experts effortlessly bypassed the killer's rudimentary, fundamentally flawed attempts at digital deletion, recovering a deeply embedded Microsoft Word document that contained the ultimate fatal error. Deep within the encrypted digital footprint, the recovered metadata explicitly revealed that the document had been recently modified by a registered user named Dennis on a computer located at the Christ Lutheran Church. This singular, irrefutable piece of digital evidence instantly narrowed a seemingly impossible 30-year, multi-state manhunt down to a highly specific geographic location and a prominent congregation leader in Park City, Kansas. A rapid, highly covert background investigation immediately identified Dennis Rader, the local municipal ordinance compliance officer, as the primary suspect, a man whose physical profile and timeline perfectly matched the established parameters of the killer. Bypassing the immediate suspect to avoid triggering his finely tuned suspicion, detectives secured a highly secretive subpoena for the medical records of Rader's daughter, who was a patient at a university health clinic. The laboratory results provided an absolute, undeniable familial DNA match to the preserved biological evidence recovered from the historical crime scenes, giving the authorities the definitive legal authorization required to execute an arrest. On a cold February afternoon in 2005, a highly coordinated convoy of law enforcement vehicles quietly intercepted Rader's municipal vehicle as he drove toward his home for lunch. As heavily armed tactical officers surrounded his vehicle and placed him in handcuffs, the terrifying phantom who had ruthlessly paralyzed an entire city for 3 decades was permanently reduced to a stunned, unremarkable older man. The subsequent legal proceedings systematically stripped away the terrifying, omnipotent aura of the BTK killer, exposing Dennis Rader as nothing more than a pathetic, power-hungry sadist who relied entirely on the element of surprise. During his highly anticipated plea hearing, Rader delivered a chilling, utterly detached monologue, recounting the horrific details of his 10 brutal murders with the casual, bureaucratic tone of a man reading a mundane grocery list. He displayed an absolute absence of human empathy or remorse, meticulously describing his hit kits and strangulation techniques, while the devastated families of his victims sat weeping in the gallery, just a few feet away. The presiding judge swiftly condemned the aging predator to 10 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole and permanently eradicating any possibility of his return to society. He was immediately transferred to the maximum security El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he remains heavily guarded in solitary confinement, completely stripped of the control and public attention he so desperately craved. The profound shockwaves of his dual life utterly devastated his family, his church congregation, and the wider community, who struggled to comprehend how such profound evil had seamlessly integrated into their daily lives. His catastrophic downfall serves as a definitive case study in modern criminology, perfectly illustrating how the insatiable, narcissistic need for public acknowledgement is frequently a serial offender's most exploitable vulnerability. The very arrogance that fueled his reign of terror ultimately blinded him to the rapid advancements in digital forensics, proving that he mistakenly believed his intelligence was vastly superior to the collective capabilities of modern law enforcement. The meticulous behavioral analysis of his disastrous communications continues to train federal investigators on how to actively manipulate and trap ego-driven predators who weaponize the media. Yet, the dangerous compulsion to manipulate an active police investigation is not limited to anonymous digital media sent from the shadows. Sometimes, the most brazen killers decide to step directly in front of the television cameras, hiding their unspeakable acts behind the convincing mask of a deeply concerned community member. In the fading golden days of early August 2002, the quiet, picturesque town of Soham in Cambridgeshire represented the epitome of rural English tranquility and close-knit community life. The residential streets were typically filled with children enjoying the final, carefree weeks of their summer holidays, completely insulated from the harsh realities of urban crime that dominated national news cycles. Among these local residents were 10-year-old best friends Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, two bright and energetic girls who were virtually inseparable throughout their young lives. On the warm evening of August 4, the girls were enjoying a family barbecue at the Wells residence, celebrating the simple joys of childhood in an environment where parents rarely worried about the ultimate safety of their neighborhoods. Dressed identically in bright red Manchester United football shirts featuring the name of their favorite player, David Beckham, the two friends asked for permission to take a short walk to a local shop to purchase some sweets. This mundane, entirely innocent request was granted without hesitation, reflecting the profound trust the community placed in the safety of their familiar, quiet streets. As Holly and Jessica walked out of the front door and disappeared down the sunlit pavement, there was absolutely no indication that this ordinary errand would mark the final moments of their normal lives. The town of Soham, with its historic architecture and friendly local businesses, provided a seemingly impenetrable bubble of security that masked the dark intentions of a predator residing right in the heart of their educational system. Unbeknownst to the families finishing their Sunday evening meals, a profound tragedy was already unfolding just a short distance from their front doors, setting the stage for one of the most agonizing investigations in modern British history. The illusion of safety that defined rural Cambridgeshire was about to be irrevocably shattered, plunging the entire nation into a state of collective mourning and unprecedented media frenzy. When the evening sun fully set and the two 10-year-old girls failed to return to the Wells household, the initial flickers of parental concern rapidly escalated into an overwhelming, paralyzing panic. The families immediately began desperately searching the immediate neighborhood, knocking on the doors of friends and frantically scanning the darkening streets for any sign of the distinct red football shirts. As the terrifying reality of their absence solidified, local law enforcement was alerted, triggering an immediate and massive mobilization of police resources across the typically sleepy rural county. The Cambridgeshire Constabulary swiftly established a major incident room, treating the sudden, unexplained vanishing not as a simple case of runaway children, but as a highly suspicious, potentially criminal abduction. By the following morning, the desperate search for Holly and Jessica had transformed from a localized community effort into a massive national emergency that dominated every major television network and newspaper headline across the United Kingdom. Hundreds of local volunteers poured into the streets, scouring dense woodlands, searching deep drainage ditches, and distributing thousands of missing person flyers in a desperate bid to locate the children before it was entirely too late. The small, previously obscure town of Soham was instantly besieged by satellite trucks, aggressive investigative journalists, and a massive influx of police personnel that completely overwhelmed the local infrastructure. Amidst this chaotic atmosphere of mounting dread and frantic activity, detectives painstakingly attempted to reconstruct the girls' final known movements, desperately searching for any credible witness who might have seen them after they left the family barbecue. The agonizing absence of concrete physical evidence or credible ransom demands left the investigating officers grappling with the terrifying possibility that the girls had been intercepted by a highly opportunistic and exceptionally dangerous predator. The agonizing limbo of the disappearance created a suffocating atmosphere of suspicion within the town, where every resident was simultaneously a desperate searcher and a potential suspect in a crime that had horrified the entire country. As the desperate manhunt intensified and the national media established a permanent encampment in the center of Soham, the perpetrator made the calculated, deeply arrogant decision to step directly into the glaring spotlight of the investigation. Ian Huntley, the locally employed caretaker at the Soham Village College, aggressively inserted himself into the heart of the media circus, openly offering himself to high, high-profile television journalists as a crucial, cooperative witness. Standing near the very school grounds where he lived and worked, Huntley confidently gave live interviews to major news networks, including Sky News and the BBC, claiming to be the very last person to have spoken to Holly and Jessica before they vanished. He meticulously crafted a fabricated narrative, detailing a brief, seemingly innocent conversation he allegedly had with the girls outside his home, portraying himself as a deeply concerned community member who was desperate to assist the police. To further fortify this deceptive facade, his girlfriend Maxine Carr, who had previously worked as a teaching assistant in the girls' primary school, passionately vouched for his character and provided him with a completely false alibi for the crucial time frame of the disappearance. However, Huntley's intense, almost eager desire to remain constantly visible on national television ironically provided behavioral analysts and seasoned detectives with an unprecedented, real-time opportunity to scrutinize his highly erratic demeanor and inconsistent statements. While the grieving families remained secluded in their unimaginable pain, Huntley visibly thrived on the immense attention, repeatedly altering minor details of his story and displaying a disturbing lack of genuine emotional distress during his highly publicized broadcast appearances. Investigators quietly noted his strange compulsion to meticulously clean his vehicle, his unusual interest in the specific tactics being utilized by the search teams, and his overwhelming need to control the narrative surrounding the final moments of the girls' lives. The police strategically allowed him to continue speaking to the press, meticulously documenting his every word and action, while they simultaneously began quietly dismantling the fragile, interconnected web of lies he had constructed with his partner. The very television cameras Huntley utilized to project his innocence ultimately captured the undeniable micro-expressions of a guilty man unraveling under pressure, transforming his arrogant public relations campaign into a legally fatal documentation of his own deception. The terrifying facade constructed by the Soham school caretaker finally collapsed under the crushing weight of relentless police scrutiny and undeniable physical evidence just 13 days after the girls initially disappeared. Detectives aggressively targeted the false alibi provided by Maxine Carr, uncovering irrefutable documentary proof that she was actually visiting family in Grimsby, hundreds of miles away, precisely when she claimed to be at home with Huntley. As the structural integrity of his primary defense disintegrated, investigators executed a highly coordinated, comprehensive forensic search of Huntley's residence and the surrounding school grounds, treating the caretaker as the prime suspect in a double homicide. The definitive breakthrough in the grueling investigation occurred when search teams methodically examining a large, industrial waste bin on the college premises discovered the partially burned, unmistakable remains of 2 red Manchester United football shirts. This horrific discovery provided the absolute, undeniable physical link required to arrest Ian Huntley and Maxine Carr, instantly transforming the highly visible, supposedly helpful witness into the central focus of a massive murder inquiry. Simultaneously, a passing civilian walking through a remote, densely wooded area near an airbase in Lakenheath, several miles from Soham, made the devastating discovery of the 2 girls' heavily decomposed bodies lying together in a shallow, overgrown ditch. Stripped of his public audience and cornered within the harsh, unforgiving environment of a police interrogation room, Huntley's arrogant, media-friendly persona completely evaporated, replaced by a desperate, panicked suspect entirely incapable of logically explaining the mounting forensic evidence against him. He pointlessly attempted to claim the deaths were a tragic, accidental result of the girls accidentally falling into his bathtub, a pathetic, scientifically impossible lie that was immediately entirely dismantled by forensic pathologists and seasoned homicide detectives. The shocking revelation that the very man who had confidently stared into television cameras to express his profound concern was actually the brutal murderer sent a paralyzing wave of anger and profound betrayal throughout the entire nation. The monster had not been lurking in the dark shadows of a distant city, but had instead boldly positioned himself at the exact center of the tragedy, arrogantly believing his fabricated performance could outsmart one of the largest police investigations in modern British history. The subsequent legal proceedings at the historic Old Bailey in London systematically exposed the full, horrifying extent of Ian Huntley's deceptive actions and his profound, sociopathic lack of fundamental human empathy. After a highly publicized and emotionally grueling trial, the jury decisively rejected his absurd fabrications of accidental death, officially convicting him of the premeditated double murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. The presiding judge delivered a scathing condemnation of his brutal actions and his cruel manipulation of the grieving community, sentencing Huntley to serve a minimum of 40 years in a maximum security prison, ensuring he will likely die behind bars. Maxine Carr was simultaneously convicted of perverting the course of justice for intentionally providing the false alibi that severely delayed the critical early stages of the investigation, resulting in a relatively short prison sentence that deeply enraged the British public. Following her eventual release from custody, the immense public fury directed at Carr necessitated an unprecedented, highly expensive legal injunction that granted her lifelong anonymity and a completely new identity to physically protect her from severe vigilante retaliation. The devastating loss of Holly and Jessica permanently scarred the formerly idyllic town of Soham, fundamentally altering the way British educational institutions conduct criminal background checks and safeguard the vulnerable children entrusted to their daily care. Huntley's disastrous decision to aggressively court the media spotlight remains a textbook case study in the fatal arrogance of narcissistic offenders, proving that an insatiable desire for public relevance is often the exact psychological mechanism that ensures their inevitable capture. He currently resides in the highly fortified confines of HMP Franklin. Entirely stripped of the television cameras and the false moral authority he once desperately utilized to manipulate the nation's collective grief. The profound hubris that drives a killer to openly mock the investigative process while hiding in plain sight is not exclusively a modern phenomenon born of the television age, but rather a dark psychological trait that has deeply entrenched historical roots. Long before satellite trucks and breaking news broadcasts existed, the original blueprint for the taunting, arrogant predator was violently established in the fog-drenched, cobblestone streets of Victorian London by a phantom who actively authored his own terrifying mythology. In the autumn of 1888, the sprawling, labyrinthine district of Whitechapel in London's East End was a suffocating epicenter of extreme poverty, severe overcrowding, and desperate daily survival. The narrow fog-drenched cobblestone alleyways were densely packed with destitute laborers, transient immigrants, and vulnerable women who were frequently forced by severe economic hardship into the perilous trade of casual prostitution, just to secure a bed for the night. This grim, unforgiving environment offered virtually no social safety net for individuals like Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman, women who tragically navigated the margins of Victorian society while struggling with the devastating impacts of alcoholism and absolute poverty. Their harsh, transient lives were defined by a constant, exhausting search for temporary lodgings in overcrowded workhouses or squalid common lodging houses, where a few pennies meant the difference between sleeping indoors or facing the brutal elements of the London streets. Despite the inherent dangers of the Victorian slums, the violence these women typically encountered was localized and relatively predictable, usually stemming from domestic disputes or drunken brawls, rather than calculated, predatory malice. The policing of this densely populated district was handled by the Metropolitan Police's H Division, an overworked constabulary that primarily dealt with petty theft and routine street violence, completely unprepared for the unprecedented savagery that was about to unfold. On the dark, damp night of August 31, the brutal murder and subsequent post-mortem mutilation of Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row fundamentally shattered the grim, but established status quo of the East End. The extraordinary violence of the attack, characterized by deep, precise incisions that indicated a terrifying level of post-mortem anatomical exploration, immediately signaled to the authorities that a new, highly dangerous breed of predator was roaming their jurisdiction. The local residents, already burdened by the daily misery of extreme poverty, were suddenly thrust into a state of collective, paralyzing terror as the horrific realization dawned that an invisible monster was hunting their most vulnerable members. This initial slaughter, tragically followed by the equally brutal murder of Annie Chapman just over a week later, permanently erased any remaining illusion of safety within Whitechapel, setting the stage for a period of absolute public hysteria that would forever alter the global landscape of criminal history. The trajectory of the Whitechapel investigation shifted irrevocably from a localized hunt for a vicious murderer to a highly publicized, psychological spectacle when the elusive perpetrator made the calculated decision to actively engage with the authorities and the burgeoning mass media. In late September of 1888, the Central News Agency of London received a deeply unsettling, red, inked letter addressed, "Dear Boss," which immediately escalated the panic by brazenly claiming absolute responsibility for the escalating series of mutilation murders. This specific piece of correspondence, written with a chillingly jovial and mocking tone, contained specific threats of future violence and famously concluded with the chilling signature, "Jack the Ripper," officially christening the unknown phantom with a terrifying moniker that would instantly dominate global newspaper headlines. The deliberate act of giving himself a dramatic, highly memorable name demonstrated a profound, narcissistic desire for public recognition, fundamentally transforming the unknown killer from a mere butcher in the shadows into a mythical, almost supernatural figure of urban terror. The Metropolitan Police initially, and mistakenly dismissed the correspondence as the crude work of an opportunistic journalist attempting to boost newspaper circulation. A fatal underestimation of the killer's audacious need to humiliate the establishment. However, the subsequent publication of the letter on broadsheet posters across the city inadvertently provided the murderer with the exact massive public platform he so desperately craved, weaponizing the immense power of the Victorian press against the struggling investigation. This provocative communication directly invited the public into the gruesome narrative, turning the brutal slaughter of impoverished women into a morbid form of public entertainment while simultaneously challenging the highest levels of British law enforcement to a deadly game of cat and mouse. By officially breaking his silence, the killer established a terrifying new precedent in criminal behavior, demonstrating that the psychological manipulation of the public and the police could be just as satisfying as the physical acts of violence he committed in the dark alleyways. The letter served as a dark, irrevocable point of no return for the investigation, ensuring that the authorities were no longer simply searching for a violent man, but were actively combating a highly communicative, media-savvy phantom who thoroughly enjoyed orchestrating the chaos. The introduction of this taunting correspondence fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the manhunt, directly inspiring countless copycats and severely complicating the genuine investigative efforts of the overwhelmed detectives, desperately searching for a needle in a rapidly expanding haystack. As the chilling moniker saturated the streets of London, the atmosphere within Whitechapel deteriorated into a state of absolute, suffocating panic, severely exacerbated by the killer's relentless escalation of violence and the police department's visible inability to secure the district. The investigative efforts led by prominent figures, such as Inspector Frederick Aberline, were constantly hindered by the sheer density of the population, the total lack of modern forensic science, and the overwhelming influx of thousands of fake letters generated by a terrified and deeply captivated public. The pressure on the Metropolitan Police reached an agonizing crescendo during the early hours of September 30, a night of unprecedented savagery historically documented as the double event, wherein the murderer claimed the lives of both Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes within a single hour. The chaotic disruption of the first murder in Duffields Yard seemingly frustrated the killer, driving him to immediately seek out a second victim in Meter Square, where he executed a horrific, surgical mutilation right in the heart of the heavily patrolled City of London jurisdiction. In the immediate aftermath of this dual slaughter, police discovered a bloodied piece of Eddowes' apron, discarded in a doorway on Golston Street, situated directly beneath a cryptic, heavily debated chalk message scrawled on the brick wall. The controversial decision by Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren to immediately erase the graffiti before it could be properly photographed destroyed potentially vital evidence, further fueling intense public outrage and the growing perception that the authorities were hopelessly outmatched. The sensationalist newspapers of the era aggressively capitalized on this perceived police incompetence, publishing increasingly lurid, highly speculative theories that the killer was a mad doctor, an aristocratic madman, or a foreign lunatic, thereby amplifying the hysteria to unmanageable levels. Detectives frantically conducted house-to-house searches, interviewing thousands of individuals and detaining numerous suspects ranging from local butchers to highly educated surgeons, yet they consistently failed to produce any tangible, definitive link to the phantom terrorizing the East End. The sheer volume of noise generated by the press and the public effectively camouflaged the true predator, allowing him to walk freely among the heavily reinforced patrols while the police drowned in a sea of false leads and useless information. The killer's brazen ability to strike twice in one night and vanish without a trace into the dense London fog demonstrated a terrifying level of geographic familiarity and operational discipline, proving that the taunting letters were not hollow threats, but the confident boasts of a deeply organized psychopath. The psychological warfare waged against the citizens and the authorities reached its absolute, terrifying zenith in mid-October with the delivery of a package that permanently eradicated any lingering doubts about the killer's willingness to engage in horrific physical taunts. George Lusk, the prominent chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small, unassuming cardboard box in the mail that contained a deeply disturbing, barely legible letter famously headed with the chilling, ominous address, "From Hell." Accompanying this terrifying piece of correspondence was a small section of human remains, specifically half of a human kidney preserved in ordinary wine, which the writer morbidly claimed to have surgically extracted from the body of Catherine Eddowes before frying and consuming the other half. While countless hoax letters had flooded the local post offices, medical examinations of this specific organ revealed it suffered from Bright's disease, a condition consistent with the medical history of the heavily mutilated victim, lending a horrifying degree of authenticity to the gruesome package. This direct, deeply personal attack on the leader of the Citizen Patrol group was a devastating demonstration of the killer's supreme arrogance, proving that he was intimately aware of the specific individuals who were actively attempting to coordinate his capture. The "From Hell" letter eschewed the jovial, theatrical tone of previous communications, replacing it with a raw, visceral malice that severely rattled the seasoned investigators and sent a fresh, paralyzing wave of terror washing over the already exhausted district. By physically mailing a piece of his victim through the Royal Mail system, the murderer definitively proved that he held absolute contempt for the investigative process and possessed a level of depravity that completely defied contemporary Victorian understanding. This shocking delivery marked the absolute climax of his communicative terror, serving as an irrefutable, ghastly trophy that the killer weaponized to maximize the psychological trauma inflicted upon the community and to directly mock the fundamental helplessness of the police forces. The package forced the authorities to confront the terrifying reality that they were dealing with an unprecedented, highly intelligent predator who not only butchered his victims with surgical precision, but fundamentally understood how to utilize terror as a highly effective instrument of psychological control. The presentation of the kidney was not merely a gruesome souvenir, but a definitive, historic declaration of supreme dominance, cementing his dark legacy as the ultimate, untouchable mastermind of the East End before he retreated back into the impenetrable shadows. The unparalleled horror of the Autumn of Terror culminated in the enclosed, bloody confines of Miller's Court in November of 1888, where the killer brutally slaughtered Mary Jane Kelly with a level of frenzied, catastrophic violence that exceeded all of his previous atrocities. Following this ultimate display of uninhibited butchery, the sudden, entirely unexplained cessation of the murders left the Metropolitan Police permanently grasping at shadows, completely unable to definitively identify or apprehend the phantom who had single-handedly paralyzed the British Empire. The vast, exhaustive investigative files remained agonizingly open, filled with thousands of witness statements, highly speculative suspect profiles, and controversial theories, yet utterly devoid of the singular, irrefutable piece of evidence required to officially close the most infamous cold case in history. The profound historical impact of the Whitechapel murders extends far beyond the tragic loss of the victims, as the case formally established the modern, sensationalized dynamic between elusive serial predators, desperate law enforcement agencies, and a voracious mass media. The killer's arrogant, calculated decision to name himself and actively mock the authorities provided a highly dangerous, psychological blueprint that would be eagerly replicated by countless ego-driven murderers throughout the ensuing centuries. His ability to entirely evade justice while simultaneously maintaining a high-profile correspondence with the public solidified his dark mythology, forever cementing Jack the Ripper not merely as a historical murderer, but as the enduring, archetypal phantom of the modern true crime genre. The definitive failure of the Victorian police to capture the killer serves as a permanent, haunting reminder of the severe limitations of early investigative techniques when confronted with a fundamentally chaotic, highly organized psychopathic force operating within a dense urban environment. Despite over a century of relentless historical debate, advanced forensic speculation, and countless literary investigations, the true identity of the man who authored the From Hell letter remains permanently obscured by the impenetrable fog of history. The terrifying reality that he simply walked away from his atrocities, leaving only a trail of mocking ink and shattered lives, continues to horrify and captivate the global imagination to this very day. Yet, the deep-seated compulsion to manipulate a narrative and deceive the authorities is not restricted to anonymous, shadowy figures of the past. Sometimes, the most sophisticated facades of innocence are meticulously constructed in the harsh, high-definition glare of the modern news cycle by seemingly devoted husbands hiding unimaginable guilt. In the summer of 2004, Salt Lake City, Utah, presented a picture of idyllic, community-oriented tranquility, deeply rooted in the strong familial values and religious devotion characteristic of the region. At the absolute center of this seemingly perfect societal tapestry were Mark and Lori Hacking, a young, vibrant, and incredibly popular married couple who perfectly embodied the aspirations of their affluent, tightly knit community. Lori was a highly successful, exceptionally bright financial analyst at a local Wells Fargo branch, adored by her colleagues and eagerly anticipating the next chapter of her life as an expectant mother. Mark projected the impeccable image of a dedicated, highly driven academic overachiever, widely celebrated by his friends and family, for recently graduating with honors from the University of Utah. The young couple was actively in the frantic, exciting process of packing their belongings, preparing to relocate across the country to North Carolina, where Mark had allegedly been accepted into a highly prestigious medical school program. To the outside observer, their marriage appeared absolutely flawless, representing a beautiful partnership built on mutual trust, shared religious faith, and the promise of a highly lucrative, respectable future in the medical field. Their families beamed with immense pride, entirely unaware that the foundation of this supposedly perfect union was constructed on a fragile, highly volatile fault line of pathological deception that was rapidly approaching a catastrophic rupture. The bright, sunlit days of July were supposed to be filled with farewell parties and the joyful anticipation of a new baby, insulating the couple in a protective bubble of suburban success and familial approval. There was absolutely no visible indication, no subtle crack in the meticulously maintained facade, to suggest that the charming, handsome husband was harboring a dark, all-consuming secret that fundamentally contradicted his public persona, behind the closed doors of their comfortable apartment. The heavily fabricated reality Mark had painstakingly maintained for years was precariously close to collapsing, setting the stage for a devastating betrayal that would soon captivate and horrify the entire nation. The carefully constructed illusion of the hacking's perfect life violently shattered on the morning of July 19, 2004, when Mark frantically contacted the Salt Lake City Police Department to report his pregnant wife missing. He presented a terrifying narrative to the responding officers, claiming that Lori had left their apartment before sunrise for her routine morning jog through the heavily wooded trails of Memory Grove Park and had completely vanished without a trace. This sudden, unexplained disappearance of a beautiful, expectant mother from a popular, seemingly safe recreational area immediately triggered a massive, high-priority emergency response from local law enforcement and search and rescue teams. Within hours, the quiet trails of the park were swarming with police dogs, hovering helicopters, and hundreds of desperate civilian volunteers who scoured the rugged terrain in a frantic race against the clock. Mark aggressively positioned himself at the absolute center of the rapidly expanding media circus, deliberately stepping in front of the local and national television cameras to deliver tearful, highly emotional pleas for his wife's safe return. He portrayed himself as the quintessential devastated husband, a desperate man whose entire world had been torn apart by a shadowy, unknown predator lurking within the city limits. His televised performances were masterful displays of orchestrated grief, designed specifically to manipulate the deep empathy of the public, while simultaneously directing the police investigation as far away from himself as possible. The community rallied intensely behind the grieving husband, organizing massive volunteer search parties, printing thousands of missing person flyers, and holding emotional candlelight vigils to support a man they believed was living through every spouse's worst nightmare. However, while the public wept for Mark's profound tragedy, seasoned homicide detectives silently began to notice subtle, highly concerning inconsistencies in his timeline and his strangely composed demeanor when the cameras were briefly turned off. This highly publicized cry for help marked the fatal point of no return, transforming a missing person case into a deeply scrutinized national spectacle that would ultimately expose the staggering depth of the husband's deceit. As the intense, heavily publicized search operations expanded outward from Memory Grove Park, investigators quietly shifted their analytical focus directly onto the grieving husband, initiating a comprehensive background check that rapidly exposed a chilling alternate reality. Detectives painstakingly tracing Mark's movements on the morning of the disappearance discovered a crucial, deeply suspicious discrepancy. Rather than frantically searching for his wife, security footage and receipts proved he was at a local store purchasing a new mattress. When authorities pressed further into the highly credentialed academic life Mark had so proudly broadcasted to his family and the community, the entire, elaborate architecture of his existence completely disintegrated under basic institutional scrutiny. The University of Utah definitively confirmed that Mark Hacking had never actually graduated from their institution, having covertly dropped out of his undergraduate classes years prior while continuing to pretend he was a dedicated, full-time student. Furthermore, the prestigious medical school in North Carolina, the very destination the couple was currently packing to move to, possessed absolutely no record of his application, let alone the acceptance letter he had triumphantly shown his wife. Investigators quickly deduced the horrifying psychological motive for the crime, realizing that Lori, heavily pregnant and preparing to relocate her entire life, had inevitably discovered the devastating truth that her husband was a pathological fraud. The realization that she had placed a frantic, tearful phone call to the university just days before her disappearance provided the police with the exact, fatal catalyst that precipitated the extreme domestic violence. Mark had constructed an impenetrable labyrinth of lies so massive that the only way he believed he could prevent the total, humiliating destruction of his reputation was to permanently silence the single person who had uncovered his secret. While the community continued to desperately search the local canyons and parks for a random abductor, the police covertly secured search warrants for the Hacking apartment, utilizing advanced forensic techniques to discover trace amounts of blood evidence, meticulously cleaned from the bedroom, and a recovered knife. The media narrative rapidly transitioned from a heartbreaking search and rescue mission to a dark, psychological thriller. as the public slowly realized the tearful man begging for help on television was actively orchestrating one of the most sociopathic cover-ups in Utah history. The unbearable, crushing pressure of the intensifying police investigation and the imminent collapse of his fabricated public identity finally triggered a severe psychological fracture within the cornered husband. Forcing the truth into the light, just days into the grueling search, Mark suffered a highly public, bizarre breakdown, resulting in him being found wandering completely naked outside a local motel in the middle of the night, leading to his immediate involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility. It was within the sterile, heavily monitored confines of this locked psychiatric ward that the ultimate, horrifying climax of the investigation unfolded, completely devoid of any cinematic interrogations or dramatic courtroom confrontations. During a deeply emotional, private visit from his two older brothers, the immense weight of his guilt finally overrode his deceptive instincts, and Mark tearfully confessed the brutal reality of what he had done in the dark hours of July 19. He coldly admitted that after a massive, emotionally devastating argument regarding the complete fabrication of his medical school acceptance, he waited until Lori was peacefully asleep before retrieving a .22 caliber rifle and fatally shooting her in the head. He then meticulously detailed his gruesome, calculated post-mortem actions, describing how he wrapped his pregnant wife's body in heavy plastic garbage bags, quietly transported her to a local commercial dumpster under the cover of darkness, and returned home to dispose of the mattress. The brothers, utterly horrified by the monstrous reality of their siblings' actions, made the incredibly agonizing but morally necessary decision to immediately relay this full, detailed confession directly to the Salt Lake City Police Department. This devastating revelation completely aborted the massive, misguided civilian search efforts in the nearby canyons, instantly pivoting the massive law enforcement apparatus toward a grim, highly complex recovery mission at the local municipal landfill. The sudden, shocking plot twist completely paralyzed the local community, as the very individual who had confidently utilized the television news cameras to beg for municipal assistance was irrefutably unmasked as a calculated, deeply selfish murderer. The meticulously maintained mask of the desperate, loving husband was permanently destroyed, leaving behind nothing but the chilling reality of a man who willingly annihilated his own family solely to protect his fragile ego from the humiliation of exposure. Armed with the horrific details of the psychiatric ward confession, law enforcement authorities initiated an unprecedented, physically grueling search of the massive Salt Lake County landfill. A monumental logistical undertaking that required detectives to manually sift through thousands of tons of compacted, hazardous garbage. After 33 agonizing days of relentless, dangerous excavation in the sweltering summer heat, search teams finally recovered Lori's decomposed remains, providing undeniable forensic confirmation of the murder and allowing her devastated family to lay her to rest. Facing an absolute mountain of irrefutable physical evidence and the highly damaging testimony of his own brothers, Mark Hacking was formally charged with first-degree murder. Completely stripped of the academic and social prestige he had literally killed to protect. In order to definitively avoid the looming threat of the death penalty, he ultimately entered a guilty plea, standing before a highly emotional courtroom to publicly admit his crimes, while the grieving family and his wife watched in profound, agonizing. The presiding judge delivered a remarkably stern, uncompromising sentencing, condemning him to serve a term of 6 years to life in the Utah State prison system, virtually guaranteeing he will spend the vast majority, if not the entirety, of his natural life incarcerated. His catastrophic downfall stands as a chilling, definitive case study in the extreme, lethal dangers of pathological narcissism, demonstrating how a desperate desire to maintain a fabricated societal image can rapidly escalate into unspeakable violence. The case fundamentally altered the way local law enforcement approaches highly publicized, tearful pleas from the spouses of missing persons, permanently cementing the investigative mandate to deeply scrutinize the most vocal, seemingly cooperative family members. He remains heavily secured behind the concrete walls of the state penitentiary, a permanently disgraced figure whose arrogant manipulation of the media ultimately served as the exact catalyst for his total, irreversible destruction. However, the dark, sociopathic tactic of utilizing television cameras to orchestrate a public tragedy and deflect criminal suspicion is a devastatingly common strategy among narcissistic offenders who crave the spotlight. This exact, twisted manipulation of public sympathy would be horrifically replicated across the Atlantic, where a deeply controlling father decided that the most effective way to seek revenge and secure an entirely new, heavily subsidized home was to deliberately set his own house on fire with his children sleeping inside. In the working-class district of Allenton within the city of Derby, England, the spring of 2012 presented a picture of a tight-knit, resilient community where neighbors closely looked out for one another amidst the daily struggles of economic hardship. At the absolute center of this densely populated residential area stood 18 Victory Road, a cramped, heavily subsidized council house that served as the chaotic epicenter for one of the most unconventional and highly controversial domestic arrangements in the entire nation. The household was entirely dominated by Mick Philpott, a profoundly manipulative, aggressively controlling patriarch who had previously gained national notoriety by shamelessly appearing on daytime television talk shows to publicly boast about his state-funded lifestyle. He aggressively maintained a deeply toxic, highly volatile polyamorous relationship under a single roof, cohabitating with his legal wife, Mered, and his long-term mistress, Lisa Willis, alongside a staggering total of 11 children who were wholly dependent on the turbulent adults around them. Despite the deeply dysfunctional, fiercely patriarchal environment engineered by a man who demanded absolute obedience and financial subservience from the women in his life, the children themselves remained remarkably innocent, bright and deeply cherished by the surrounding neighborhood. They routinely attended local educational institutions, enthusiastically played in the nearby parks, and represented the only genuine source of purity within a household fundamentally structured around Mick's insatiable, narcissistic demands for control and public attention. The community largely tolerated the bizarre family dynamic, viewing Philpott as a loud, deeply unsavory neighborhood nuisance rather than a legitimate, lethal threat to the vulnerable dependents living within the heavily overcrowded walls of his residence. There was absolutely no visible indication that the fragile, toxic equilibrium maintaining this enormous family was rapidly approaching a breaking point that would culminate in an unimaginable, heavily premeditated horror. The fundamental illusion that the children were at least physically safe within the confines of their chaotic home masked the dark, calculating intentions of a father who viewed human lives entirely as pawns in his relentless pursuit of financial gain and personal vendettas. Unbeknownst to the sleeping neighborhood, a monstrous, unbelievably reckless plot was actively being orchestrated within the mind of a man whose fragile ego had recently suffered a severe, intolerable blow, setting the stage for a catastrophic tragedy that would permanently scar the British conscience. The fragile, chaotic stability of the Philpott household was violently, irrevocably shattered in the pre-dawn darkness of May 11, 2012, when a ferocious, fast-moving fire suddenly engulfed the ground floor of the Victory Road property. As the highly accelerated flames rapidly consumed the narrow hallway and completely blocked the only viable exit, a dense, heavily toxic plume of black smoke aggressively surged up the central staircase, directly towards the bedrooms where 6 innocent children were peacefully sleeping. Desperate, terrified screams pierced the quiet suburban night, prompting numerous neighbors to frantically rush from their homes in a valiant, deeply heroic attempt to breach the burning structure and rescue the trapped, panicking occupants. Despite their relentless efforts to smash windows and force entry with heavy tools, the sheer intensity of the blazing inferno and the suffocating heat violently repelled anyone who attempted to navigate the fully engulfed ground floor. Emergency services arrived rapidly on the scene in a massive, coordinated response, with highly trained firefighters aggressively battling the massive blaze in a desperate race against time to reach the upper levels of the fiercely burning home. Tragically, By the time the emergency crews managed to penetrate the thick, blinding smoke and locate the children, the severe inhalation of toxic fumes had already exacted a devastating, irreversible toll on their small, fragile bodies. 5 of the children, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jaden, were tragically pronounced dead at the horrific scene, while the eldest, Duane, succumbed to his catastrophic injuries a few days later in a specialized pediatric hospital, completely wiping out an entire generation of the family. In the immediate, chaotic aftermath of the devastating blaze, the incident was initially treated by responding authorities and the deeply traumatized community as a horrific, targeted arson attack perpetrated by a shadowy, unknown assailant holding a violent grudge against the controversial family. Mick Philpott aggressively fueled this narrative from the very first moments, dramatically portraying himself as an agonizingly desperate father who had valiantly, yet unsuccessfully, fought through the searing flames to save his beloved offspring. This initial, terrifying perception of a random, cowardly attack on sleeping children plunged the entire city of Derby into a state of profound mourning and intense, paralyzing fear, initiating a massive police manhunt for the phantom arsonist responsible for the merciless slaughter. As the massive police investigation gained momentum and the nation mourned the unimaginable loss, Mick Philpott made the highly calculated, disastrously arrogant decision to step directly into the glaring spotlight of a nationally televised press conference. Flanked by his heavily subdued wife, May Reed, and completely surrounded by senior police officials, Philpott delivered a highly theatrical, intensely dramatic performance designed to secure maximum public sympathy and completely control the rapidly developing media narrative. He collapsed into uncontrollable, exaggerated sobbing fits, dramatically clutched a crumpled tissue to his face, and aggressively pleaded with the British public to help apprehend the ruthless killers who had supposedly targeted his family in the dead of night. However, seasoned homicide detectives and highly trained behavioral analysts observing the broadcast immediately registered profound, deeply disturbing anomalies in his highly orchestrated, incredibly performative display of supposed grief. Investigators noted the absolute, chilling absence of actual tears during his dramatic crying spells, his strange, almost eager willingness to engage directly with the cameras, and a bizarre, narcissistic fixation on portraying himself as a valiant hero rather than a devastated parent. Concurrently, the intensive background investigation into the family dynamics uncovered a massive, highly volatile motive. Lisa Willis, his long-term mistress, had recently summoned the immense courage to permanently leave the abusive household, taking her children and substantially reducing his lucrative state benefit income. Detectives quickly formulated a deeply chilling theory: the fire was not a random attack, but a meticulously planned, heavily orchestrated stunt designed by Philpott to frame his ex-mistress, ultimately allowing him to regain custody of her children and secure an even larger, more heavily subsidized council house. To conclusively prove this monstrous hypothesis, without prematurely alerting the highly suspicious suspect, the Derbyshire Constabulary initiated a highly sophisticated, covert intelligence operation, strategically placing hidden listening devices inside the temporary hotel room provided to the grieving couple. The authorities deliberately allowed Philpott to continue his extensive, highly publicized media campaign, meticulously documenting his every contradictory statement while patiently waiting for the heavily monitored suspects to incriminate themselves in the privacy of their secluded accommodations. This brilliant, highly patient investigative strategy perfectly exploited the killer's fundamental arrogance, ensuring that the very man who sought to manipulate the national media would ultimately be undone by his own sheer inability to remain silent behind closed doors. The decisive, unescapable climax of the harrowing investigation unfolded within the sterile, heavily surveilled confines of the police-funded hotel room, where the true, unimaginably dark nature of the grieving father was permanently captured on high-definition audio recordings. Unaware of the hidden microphones meticulously planted by covert surveillance teams, Mick Philpott, Mayred Philpott, and their close associate Paul Mosley engaged in highly incriminating, deeply sociopathic conversations that completely contradicted their public displays of agony. The chilling audio tapes recorded the trio casually discussing the ongoing police investigation, ruthlessly coaching each other on how to synchronize their fabricated timelines, and displaying an absolute, horrifying absence of any genuine emotional distress regarding the brutal deaths of the 6 children. Philpott was captured actively demanding that his wife stick strictly to the prearranged script, demonstrating his continued tyrannical control over the narrative and confirming his central, orchestrating role in the deadly, calculated arson plot. Armed with this devastating, irrefutable electronic evidence, along with complex forensic analysis proving the fire was deliberately ignited from the inside of the hallway using a significant quantity of petrol, armed police dramatically executed coordinated arrests of all 3 individuals. The agonizing, completely unimaginable plot twist sent a paralyzing shockwave of anger and profound disgust throughout the entire United Kingdom, completely reversing the immense public sympathy that had previously been intensely directed toward the family. The investigation conclusively proved that Philpott had deliberately poured the highly flammable accelerant through the letterbox and ignited it, intending to stage a heroic rescue and frame his departed mistress. But he had catastrophically underestimated the terrifying, explosive ferocity of a confined petrol fire. His supreme, mind-boggling arrogance led him to believe he could seamlessly control a raging inferno just as easily as he controlled the vulnerable women in his life, resulting in the horrific, agonizing deaths of the very children he viewed as nothing more than disposable assets. Stripped of his televised audience and cornered in the unforgiving environment of a police interrogation room, his theatrical bravado completely evaporated, replaced by aggressive, uncooperative silence as he realized his masterfully constructed facade had been entirely dismantled by his own whispered words. The devastating reality that the grieving father crying on national television was the exact architect of the inferno transformed a tragic accident into one of the most callous, deeply narcissistic crimes in modern European history. The subsequent, highly charged criminal proceedings at the Nottingham Crown Court systematically exposed the full, horrifying depth of Mick Philpott's deceptive, violently controlling nature and his profound lack of basic human morality. Following a grueling, emotionally devastating trial that heavily featured the damning hotel surveillance tapes and irrefutable forensic fire analysis, the jury decisively convicted Mick, Merritt, and Paul Mosley of 6 counts of manslaughter, utterly rejecting their fabricated claims of innocence. The presiding judge delivered a historically scathing, uncompromising sentencing remark, explicitly condemning Philpott as a disturbingly dangerous, incredibly manipulative individual possessing no moral compass whatsoever, sentencing him to a life term in prison with a substantial minimum tariff. Merritt, Philpott, and Paul Mosley were severely punished with significant custodial sentences for their active, cowardly participation in the deadly scheme, holding them fully accountable for failing to protect the innocent lives destroyed by their collective recklessness. The profound, lingering trauma inflicted upon the local community of Allenton necessitated the complete demolition of 18 Victory Road, replacing the charred remnants of the House of Horrors with a quiet memorial space to permanently honor the deeply missed children. Philpott's disastrous decision to weaponize the media and exploit a highly orchestrated public tragedy serves as a terrifying, definitive case study in the lethal extremes of narcissistic entitlement and the dangerous lengths an ego-driven abuser will go to maintain absolute control. He remains securely isolated within the heavily fortified walls of a high-security British prison. Permanently despised by the public and entirely stripped of the manipulative power and television cameras he once desperately used to fund his parasitic existence. The chilling reality that a parent could comfortably stand before a bank of news cameras and shed false tears for the children he just murdered remains one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena encountered by modern behavioral analysts. Yet, the calculated use of the press to project an aura of total innocence is not always characterized by dramatic, weeping theatricality. Sometimes, the most terrifying predators choose a completely different approach, relying on a chilling, sociopathic calmness to deflect the attention of desperate investigators. This exact, terrifyingly flat presentation of grief would soon mesmerize and horrify the American public, as another handsome, seemingly perfect husband attempted to mask his monstrous betrayal behind an emotionless void, while his pregnant wife remained missing in the cold waters of a California bay. In the crisp, festive weeks leading up to the Christmas holiday of 2002, the agricultural city of Modesto, California, was enveloped in a comforting atmosphere of suburban tranquility and cheerful community anticipation. Among the residents preparing for the upcoming celebrations were Scott and Lassie Peterson, an incredibly attractive, upwardly mobile young couple who seemingly represented the absolute pinnacle of the modern American dream. Lassie was a vibrant, deeply beloved substitute teacher with a famously infectious smile, heavily pregnant with their first child, a boy they had already joyfully decided to name Connor. Scott projected the highly polished, meticulously maintained image of a dedicated, hard-working fertilizer salesman, a quiet but supportive husband who perfectly complemented his wife's outgoing, highly sociable personality. Their beautiful home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood was elegantly decorated for the holidays, serving as a popular gathering place for their tightly knit extended families and a wide circle of devoted friends. To the outside observer, their marriage appeared entirely flawless, completely devoid of any financial distress or domestic turbulence that would typically precede a catastrophic criminal event. The couple spent their evenings excitedly preparing the baby's nursery with a distinct nautical theme, actively participating in a blissful domestic routine that insulated them entirely from the darker realities of violent crime. There was absolutely no visible indication, no subtle fracture in their perfectly constructed public facade to suggest that the charming, handsome husband was harboring a dark, profoundly selfish desire to completely erase his impending familial responsibilities. The fundamental illusion of their picturesque suburban existence masked a chilling, sociopathic detachment within Scott, a man who viewed his pregnant wife not as a partner, but as a burdensome obstacle to his clandestine desires. Unbeknownst to the family members joyfully purchasing Christmas gifts for the impending arrival, a horrific, meticulously calculated betrayal was silently unfolding beneath the festive decorations, setting the stage for one of the most heavily scrutinized murder investigations in American history. The carefully curated illusion of the Petersons' perfect suburban life was irrevocably shattered on the afternoon of Christmas Eve, when the Modesto Police Department received a frantic call reporting that the heavily pregnant Lassie had vanished without a trace. Scott informed responding officers that he had left his wife happily watching television and preparing to walk their golden retriever in the nearby East La Loma Park, while he drove to the Berkeley Marina for a solitary fishing trip in the San Francisco Bay. This sudden, unexplained disappearance of an 8-month pregnant woman on the eve of a major holiday immediately triggered a massive, high-priority emergency response, mobilizing hundreds of local volunteers and law enforcement personnel across the county. As the panicked community frantically scoured the local parks, dense ravines, and surrounding neighborhoods, seasoned homicide detectives quietly initiated their standard protocol of closely interviewing the spouse, expecting to encounter a husband paralyzed by overwhelming, desperate grief. Instead, they were immediately struck by Scott's profoundly unsettling, sociopathic calmness, noting his chillingly flat effect, his bizarre lack of urgent emotional distress, and his strange reluctance to actively participate in the frantic, ground-level search operations. Investigators quietly documented his highly suspicious behavior, including his immediate request to wash his clothes, his unusual refusal to undergo a polygraph examination, and his seemingly premeditated alibi complete with an unprompted, freshly printed parking receipt from the marina. This devastating inciting incident completely transformed a joyous holiday gathering into a paralyzing nightmare for Lassie's devoted family, instantly pivoting the massive law enforcement apparatus from a standard missing person search to a highly focused, deeply suspicious criminal inquiry. The police recognized almost immediately that they were not dealing with a random, opportunistic abduction, but rather a highly calculated, Domestic homicide orchestrated by an individual who severely underestimated the intense investigative scrutiny his actions would inevitably attract. By providing the authorities with the exact geographic location of his highly suspicious fishing trip, Scott fundamentally tethered himself to the very body of water that would ultimately betray his horrific secret, initiating a relentless, highly publicized game of cat and mouse. The devastating realization that the handsome, seemingly perfect husband was behaving more like a detached observer than a desperate, grieving partner set the stage for a grueling, months-long psychological war between a sociopathic liar and a fiercely determined police department. As the intense, highly publicized search operations extended into the early months of 2003, the suspect made the highly calculated, ultimately disastrous decision to embark on a nationwide media tour, severely underestimating the public's ability to detect his profound emotional void. Scott sat down for a series of high-profile, nationally televised interviews, most notably with veteran journalist Diane Sawyer, where he consistently delivered chillingly flat, meticulously rehearsed answers that completely lacked the visceral, messy agony of a genuinely terrified husband. He stared directly into the television cameras with dead, emotionless eyes, awkwardly referring to his missing wife in the past tense. Instead of begging for her safe return, he repeatedly attempted to legally and emotionally distance himself from the ongoing, massive police investigation. The structural integrity of his carefully maintained facade completely disintegrated when a Fresno massage therapist named Amber Frey bravely contacted the Modesto Police Department, revealing that she had been engaged in a romantic relationship with Scott. She provided investigators with the devastating detail that he had explicitly told her he was a grieving widower weeks before Lassie actually disappeared from their home. This catastrophic revelation, which the police strategically weaponized during a highly dramatic press conference, instantly obliterated Scott's public image, completely alienating Lassie's devastated family and turning the immense power of the national media aggressively against him. Unbeknownst to the killer, detectives had convinced Amber to secretly record hundreds of hours of their intimate telephone conversations, capturing Scott's terrifying ability to casually lie about his location, his emotional state, and his active participation in the search for his wife. While the local community continued to hold emotional candlelight vigils and distribute thousands of missing person flyers, Scott brazenly attempted to secretly sell Lassie's vehicle and repeatedly demonstrated a callous, sociopathic eagerness to permanently erase her from his life. The police painstakingly built a massive, circumstantial case against him, analyzing his bizarre internet searches regarding the tidal currents of the San Francisco Bay, his secretive purchase of a small aluminum boat, and his inexplicable decision to fabricate concrete anchors in his warehouse. His supreme, arrogant confidence in his own intellectual superiority blinded him to the reality that every single televised lie, every recorded phone call, and every detached, emotionless interview was systematically providing prosecutors with the exact behavioral evidence required to secure a capital murder conviction. The agonizing, highly publicized standoff between the prime suspect and the relentless investigative task force reached its definitive, inescapable climax in April of 2003, when the dark, freezing waters of the San Francisco Bay finally surrendered their horrific secrets. A civilian walking their dog along the rocky, marshy shoreline of Point Isabel made the devastating discovery of a late-term male fetus in the shallow water. This grim find was tragically followed the very next day by the recovery of heavily decomposed, partial remains of a pregnant adult female wearing distinctive maternity clothing. Forensic pathologists utilizing advanced DNA analysis conclusively identified the remains as Lassie and baby Connor, irrefutably locating the victims in the exact, highly specific body of water where Scott had so arrogantly claimed to be fishing on the precise day they vanished. The sudden, terrifying realization that his meticulously concealed crimes had been physically exposed triggered a massive, desperate panic within the suspect, completely shattering his chillingly flat demeanor. This catastrophic loss of control forced him into an immediate, highly chaotic attempt to flee the jurisdiction and evade the inevitable capital murder charges that were rapidly approaching. Unbeknownst to Scott, heavily armed, Highly coordinated surveillance teams from the California Department of Justice had been monitoring his every movement for weeks, tracking his vehicle as he aggressively drove south toward the international border with Mexico. On a sunny April morning, a convoy of unmarked police vehicles violently intercepted Scott's car in the parking lot of a coastal golf course near San Diego, physically cornering the desperate fugitive before he could successfully cross into foreign territory. When tactical officers violently extracted him from the vehicle, they discovered a chilling, undeniable manifestation of a highly premeditated guilty conscience. Scott had radically altered his appearance by bleaching his hair and goatee, and his car was packed with nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, high-end survival gear, and his brother's identification card. Stripped of his television audience and his carefully constructed, handsome facade, the arrogant fertilizer salesman was instantly reduced to a panicked, heavily restrained prisoner entirely incapable of logically explaining the massive stockpile of escape materials surrounding him. The dramatic, highly publicized arrest permanently shattered the illusion of the perfect Modesto husband, completely validating the agonizing suspicions of the grieving family and providing law enforcement with the definitive, physical culmination of their grueling, multi-million-dollar investigation. The subsequent, highly sensationalized legal proceedings systematically exposed the full, horrifying depth of Scott Peterson's deceptive, sociopathic nature and his profound lack of fundamental human morality. Following an incredibly grueling, emotionally devastating trial that captivated the entire nation for over 5 months, the jury decisively rejected his highly expensive defense team's fabricated theories of a shadowy satanic cult abduction. The panel officially convicted him of the premeditated first-degree murder of his wife and the second-degree murder of his unborn son, entirely vindicating the tireless efforts of the Modesto Police Department. The presiding judge delivered a historically stern, uncompromising sentencing remark, initially condemning Peterson to face the ultimate penalty of death by lethal injection. This severe sentence accurately reflected the profound, societal disgust generated by his uniquely callous, deeply selfish actions and his complete refusal to accept any responsibility for the slaughter of his own family. Although the California Supreme Court later overturned his death sentence due to procedural errors during jury selection, he was swiftly resentenced to serve life in prison without the absolute possibility of parole, permanently ensuring he will die behind the heavily fortified walls of the state penitentiary system. The devastating loss of Lassie and Connor permanently scarred the formerly idyllic city of Modesto, fundamentally altering the way American law enforcement approaches and heavily scrutinizes the seemingly cooperative, emotionally detached spouses of missing pregnant women. His disastrous decision to weaponize national television interviews and actively lie to a highly coordinated police task force serves as a terrifying, definitive case study in the lethal extremes of narcissistic entitlement and the dangerous lengths an ego-driven psychopath will go to maintain a facade. He remains securely isolated within the California correctional system, completely stripped of the manipulative power, the affluent lifestyle, and the television cameras he once desperately utilized to project his absolute innocence. The chilling reality that a husband could comfortably sit before a veteran journalist and casually lie about his murdered wife remains one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena ever broadcast to the American public. However, the calculated attempt to use television media to deflect criminal suspicion is not always characterized by a flat, emotionless void successfully maintained through multiple interviews. Sometimes, the crushing realization that the police have definitively uncovered the physical truth occurs directly on camera, capturing the exact, terrifying moment a narcissistic killer's entire meticulously constructed universe collapses in real time. In the sweltering, oppressive heat of late June 2011, the historic, deeply traditional city of Macon, Georgia, was enveloped in the intense, focused atmosphere characteristic of a prominent university town approaching the crucial summer testing season. At the absolute center of this highly demanding academic environment was Mercer University's Walter F. George School of Law, where recent graduates were enduring the grueling, socially isolating process of preparing for the upcoming state bar examination. Among these dedicated, deeply ambitious students was 27-year-old Lauren Giddings, a bright, universally beloved graduate originally from Maryland, who was renowned throughout the campus for her vibrant, outgoing personality and her fiercely promising legal future. She resided directly across the street from the law school campus in the Barristers Hall apartment complex, a quiet, heavily populated residential building designed specifically to provide a focused, secure environment for law students transitioning into their professional careers. To her friends and extensive network of colleagues, Lauren represented the absolute best of their tightly knit academic community, constantly organizing study groups, providing emotional support to her peers, and diligently working toward her dream of becoming a public defender. The mundane, predictable routine of highlighting legal textbooks and attending intensive review lectures insulated the student body in a protective, highly structured bubble that completely masked the terrifying reality of a lethal threat lurking within their own housing complex. Residing in the apartment immediately adjacent to Lauren was Stephen McDaniel, a highly eccentric, socially awkward classmate who actively cultivated a bizarre public persona, famously walking around the campus wearing chainmail armor and engaging in disturbing, intensely morbid conversations. Despite his deeply unsettling demeanor and aggressive social isolation, the academic community largely dismissed McDaniel as a harmless, socially inept oddity rather than a calculated, deeply obsessed predator actively hunting his own neighbor. There was absolutely no visible indication to the local authorities or the university administration that the quiet, studious environment of Barristers Hall was simultaneously serving as the primary hunting ground for a sociopathic stalker, meticulously planning an unimaginably violent intrusion. The fundamental illusion of security within the locked gates of the student housing complex was actively concealing a dark, completely unhinged obsession that was rapidly approaching a catastrophic, highly premeditated rupture. The tragic, horrifying unraveling of this quiet academic community commenced in the final days of June, when Lauren mysteriously failed to attend her highly structured bar preparation classes and abruptly ceased all digital communication with her tightly knit circle of friends and family. This sudden, deeply uncharacteristic silence immediately triggered a profound, paralyzing wave of alarm among her peers, who fundamentally understood that a dedicated law student weeks away from the bar exam would never willingly abandon her rigorous study schedule without explanation. Driven by mounting, desperate concern, her closest friends eventually utilized a spare key to access her Barristers Hall apartment, stepping into a chillingly pristine, seemingly undisturbed living space that offered no immediate signs of a violent struggle or forced entry. However, the deeply terrifying absence of her wallet, her cellular phone, and her apartment keys, combined with the fact that her vehicle remained securely parked in the complex's designated lot, instantly escalated the situation from a standard welfare check into a high-priority missing person investigation. The Macon Police Department immediately mobilized a massive, highly coordinated search effort, completely transforming the previously quiet, studious apartment complex into a chaotic, heavily fortified crime scene swarming with uniformed officers, forensic technicians, and desperate civilian volunteers. As the intense, frantic search operations expanded outwards across the city, Stephen McDaniel made the highly calculated, deeply arrogant decision to aggressively insert himself into the absolute center of the unfolding law enforcement response. He deliberately positioned himself among the terrified classmates gathering outside the police tape, actively portraying himself as a deeply concerned, highly cooperative neighbor who was eager to assist the investigating detectives in any possible capacity. He willingly submitted to voluntary police interviews, confidently attempting to establish a fabricated timeline of events and subtly attempting to direct the focus of the investigators toward vague, entirely fictionalized theories about mysterious intruders roaming the area. This critical, deeply manipulative inciting incident permanently transformed McDaniel from an obscure, socially isolated neighbor into a highly visible, incredibly brazen suspect who fundamentally believed his advanced legal education would allow him to effortlessly outsmart the seasoned homicide detectives coordinating the search. As the grueling, highly publicized search entered its crucial, most desperate phase, the suspect made a catastrophic, unbelievably arrogant miscalculation by aggressively courting the local media spotlight to publicly showcase his fabricated innocence and manufactured grief. Operating under the supreme, narcissistic delusion that he possessed the intellectual superiority required to seamlessly manipulate the press, McDaniel willingly approached a television news crew from the local WGXA affiliate who were broadcasting live from the perimeter of the Barristers Hall complex. Standing casually outside his apartment building, he initiated a rambling, highly unusual interview, delivering chillingly flat, meticulously rehearsed monologues about Lauren's daily habits, her academic schedule, and his supposed desperation for her safe return. However, highly trained behavioral analysts and seasoned investigators quietly observing the broadcast immediately registered profound, deeply disturbing anomalies in his physical presentation, most notably the completely flat, sociopathic void in his eyes and the highly suspicious, fresh scratch marks visible on his face and arms. While McDaniel arrogantly droned on about his legal theories and proudly detailed his cooperative interactions with the local authorities, he was entirely oblivious to the monumental, highly coordinated forensic operation silently unfolding just a few dozen yards behind the television cameras. Following standard, meticulous investigative protocols for missing persons cases located within high-density residential areas, a dedicated team of Macon police officers and forensic specialists were simultaneously executing a grueling, comprehensive search of the complex's communal, industrial-sized dumpsters. McDaniel continued to stare directly into the news camera, projecting an aura of total, unshakable confidence, fundamentally believing he had successfully executed the perfect, completely undetectable crime by utilizing the local municipal waste management system to permanently erase his horrific actions. The tension reached an absolute, suffocating crescendo as the killer confidently prolonged his television appearance, completely, blissfully unaware that the heavily fortified, meticulously constructed architecture of his deception was about to violently, irrevocably collide with the grim, physical reality of police procedure. The very local news broadcast he had arrogantly weaponized to declare his innocence and deflect investigative scrutiny was actively serving as the permanent, high-definition stage for his imminent psychological destruction. The definitive, absolute climax of the harrowing investigation did not occur within the sterile, highly controlled environment of a police interrogation room, but rather materialized in real time, broadcast directly onto the unedited recording of the local television journalist conducting the interview. Mid-conversation, the reporter received an urgent, breaking update from his producers and casually asked McDaniel a seemingly routine, yet fundamentally devastating question regarding the breaking news that authorities had just located a dismembered human torso wrapped in heavy plastic inside the complex's garbage receptacles. The immediate, catastrophic psychological and physical collapse of Stephen McDaniel was permanently captured on camera, serving as one of the most chilling, unadulterated documentations of a guilty conscience utterly shattering under the crushing weight of reality. His eyes immediately widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. His breathing rapidly degenerated into severe, panicked hyperventilation, and his entire body visibly locked into a state of paralyzed, uncontrollable shock as the reporter's words destroyed his entire fabricated universe. He physically staggered backward, stammering incoherently and desperately attempting to maintain his footing, instantly transitioning from a confident, highly talkative neighbor into a completely cornered, terrified suspect who realized his elaborate, highly premeditated disposal plan had just catastrophically failed on live television. This raw, unfiltered moment of psychological annihilation provided the observing detectives with the ultimate, undeniable behavioral evidence of his profound guilt, prompting law enforcement to immediately terminate the bizarre media spectacle and formally take him into custody for extensive, aggressive questioning. Subsequent, highly invasive forensic searches of his apartment, securely authorized by the undeniable probable cause generated by the discovery of the remains, revealed a horrifying, massive trove of deeply incriminating physical and digital evidence. Investigators discovered the empty packaging for a specific brand of hacksaw, master keys capable of accessing every apartment in the complex, and a chilling, highly organized collection of digital voyeurism that definitively proved he had been methodically stalking Lauren for months before executing his brutal attack. Stripped of his arrogant, deeply sociopathic delusion of committing the perfect, undetectable murder, McDaniel's highly expensive legal defenses completely crumbled under the crushing, inescapable weight of the overwhelming physical evidence and his highly publicized, deeply humiliating televised meltdown. Confronted with the absolute certainty of a capital murder trial and the highly probable execution of a death sentence, he eventually entered a formal guilty plea to the first-degree murder of Lauren Giddings, completely bypassing the dramatic courtroom spectacle he had likely envisioned for himself. During his final sentencing hearing, he delivered a cold, entirely emotionless confession that meticulously detailed how he secretly entered her apartment in the early morning hours using a stolen master key, violently strangled her in her bedroom, and subsequently utilized a hacksaw in the bathtub to dismember her remains. The presiding judge delivered a historically stern, uncompromising sentencing remark, permanently condemning the former law student to serve life in prison. Entirely removing him from the society he sought to manipulate and ensuring his expensive legal education would strictly be utilized behind the heavily fortified walls of a maximum security penitentiary. The devastating, entirely senseless loss of a bright, deeply compassionate aspiring attorney permanently scarred the Mercer University community, serving as a horrifying, enduring reminder that profound, calculated evil can seamlessly hide behind the mundane, unremarkable mask of a quiet, studious neighbor. The viral, completely unedited footage of his real-time realization of failure remains one of the most chilling, definitive psychological case studies in modern criminology, perfectly illustrating the exact, agonizing moment a narcissistic predator's ego is completely obliterated by the inescapable truth of his own incompetence. He remains permanently incarcerated within the Georgia Department of Corrections, completely stripped of the intellectual superiority, the academic prestige, and the television cameras he once desperately utilized to project his absolute control over the narrative. Yet, while McDaniel's catastrophic, on-camera collapse was a spontaneous, utterly disastrous reaction to breaking news, other communicative killers have taken a far more calculated, professional approach to inserting themselves into the media narrative, utilizing their actual, legitimate careers in journalism to publish horrific, exclusive details about the very crimes they secretly committed. In the early 2000s, the municipality of Kid-Evo, nestled within the mountainous western region of North Macedonia, was a quiet, post-industrial town characterized by strong communal ties and a struggling, transitional economy that left many of its older residents economically vulnerable. Within this tightly knit, deeply traditional society, Vlado Taneski was widely recognized as a highly respected, veteran freelance journalist who had spent over 2 decades chronicling the mundane local events, political shifts, and daily struggles of his fellow citizens for major national newspapers, like Nova Makedonija and Jutrinski Vesnik. To his neighbors, colleagues, and his estranged wife, Taneski projected the mundane, entirely unremarkable image of a quiet, dedicated professional and a father of 2, seamlessly blending into the fabric of a community where everyone knew each other and violent crime was practically non-existent. This established, unquestioned social standing provided him with an impenetrable aura of authority and trust, masking a deeply disturbed, violent psychological fracture rooted in a highly complex, deeply resentful relationship with his late mother, a woman who had worked her entire life as a cleaner. It was precisely this highly specific, deeply personal demographic that became the focal point of a terrifying, unprecedented campaign of violence targeting elderly, impoverished women who shared striking physical and occupational similarities to the woman who haunted his psyche. These vulnerable women, who navigated the quiet streets of Kit-Evo working menial cleaning jobs just to survive the harsh economic realities of the region, represented the perfect, unprotected prey for a predator operating with the absolute advantage of total societal invisibility. The fundamental illusion of safety within the aging population of the town was violently shattered when these familiar faces suddenly vanished from their established routines, entirely consumed by a shadowy figure who utilized his deep, intimate knowledge of the local landscape to execute his horrific, methodical plan. The local law enforcement infrastructure, fundamentally unequipped and completely unaccustomed to dealing with organized, serial predation, initially treated the early disappearances as tragic, yet routine missing persons cases, failing to immediately recognize the dark, cohesive pattern emerging in their jurisdiction. Unbeknownst to the terrified residents locking their doors, the monster orchestrating the slaughter was not a transient outsider, but the very man whose authoritative voice they trusted to objectively report the morning news, setting the stage for a monstrous betrayal of the public trust. The tranquil, mountainous backdrop of Kit Evo was irrevocably transformed into a hunting ground, where the journalist assigned to cover the tragedies was actively, secretly holding the bloody pen that authored them. The grim reality of a serial killer operating within the borders of North Macedonia became undeniably apparent following the horrific, consecutive discoveries of the brutally battered bodies of Mitra Simjanoska in 2005, Ljubika Lakoska in 2007, and Zivana Temelkoska in 2008, permanently destroying the town's peaceful facade. The physical condition of the victims revealed a deeply disturbing, highly ritualistic methodology. Each woman had been severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and ultimately strangled to death using a highly specific, easily recognizable type of coiled telephone cable, before being unceremoniously dumped in remote, illegal garbage sites on the outskirts of the municipality. As the overwhelmed, desperately underfunded local police force struggled to piece together the fragmented, terrifying crime scenes, Vlado Taneski aggressively inserted himself into the absolute center of the narrative, utilizing his established press credentials to gain unprecedented, completely unrestricted access to the unfolding investigation. He immediately began publishing a series of highly sensationalized, incredibly detailed front-page articles for the national press, chronicling the horrific murders with a level of gruesome specificity that simultaneously captivated and deeply horrified the entire Macedonian public. Taneski did not merely report the basic, sanitized facts provided at official police briefings. He actively visited the devastated families of the victims, sitting in their living rooms, drinking their coffee, and conducting deeply intrusive interviews under the guise of an empathetic, dedicated journalist seeking justice. He effectively weaponized his professional status to comfort the very people he had permanently shattered, utilizing these intimate, highly emotional interactions to gather further material for his exclusive, wildly successful newspaper columns that dominated the national news cycle. However, it was precisely this insatiable, narcissistic compulsion to demonstrate his supreme knowledge of the crimes that triggered the critical, fatal turning point in the previously stagnant investigation, fundamentally altering the trajectory of the massive manhunt. In his eager, highly prolific reporting, Taneski began deliberately incorporating highly specific, closely guarded forensic details regarding the exact nature of the ligatures and the specific methodologies of the murders that the police had explicitly withheld from the public domain. This arrogant, deeply calculated decision to showcase his insider knowledge instantly transformed the veteran reporter from a helpful, objective observer into a highly suspicious anomaly, drawing the intense, unblinking scrutiny of the seasoned detectives, who realized the killer was actively taunting them through the daily newspaper. As the highly detailed articles continued to dominate the newsstands, the lead detectives assigned to the Kit Evo task force initially, and logically, suspected that a severe, deeply damaging informational leak existed within their own ranks, prompting a frantic, internal investigation to identify the corrupt officer supplying the press. The police painstakingly cross-referenced every single piece of published information against their highly confidential crime scene reports, desperately attempting to plug the precise forensic details that were bleeding into the public consciousness and threatening to completely compromise any future interrogations. They closely analyzed Taneski's prolific portfolio of work, noting with mounting horror that his articles contained specific, unreleased facts about the exact type of telephone cord used to strangle Savannah Temelkoska, a crucial, defining detail that only the medical examiner, the lead detectives, and the actual perpetrator could possibly know. When the Internal Affairs investigation definitively ruled out any possibility of a police leak, the terrifying, almost incomprehensible reality began to crystallize within the minds of the investigative team. The esteemed, veteran journalist was not relying on a corrupt source, but was actively drawing upon his own, first-hand memories of the slaughter. Detectives rapidly shifted their entire investigative focus directly onto Taunting, initiating a comprehensive, highly covert background investigation that quickly exposed the chilling, deeply psychological connections between the reporter and the targeted victims. They discovered that all three murdered women had lived in close geographic proximity to Taunting, shared a striking physical resemblance to his deceased mother, and worked in the exact same menial cleaning profession she had occupied before her death, providing a massive, undeniable psychological motive for the highly specific target selection. The investigative task force strategically allowed Taunting to continue his active, daily reporting, utilizing his published articles as a real-time, highly detailed psychological profile while they quietly built an impenetrable, forensic trap entirely devoid of his knowledge. They meticulously tracked his movements, observing how he seamlessly transitioned from writing chilling columns about the Kit Evo monster to interacting normally with the local community, demonstrating a level of sociopathic compartmentalization that deeply unsettled the veteran homicide detectives monitoring his every move. To secure the absolute, definitive physical evidence required to arrest such a high-profile, deeply respected public figure, authorities executed a highly coordinated, quiet operation to legally obtain a sample of Taunting's DNA, sending the crucial biological material to a specialized, advanced forensic laboratory for urgent comparative analysis. The agonizing wait for the definitive laboratory results was heavily juxtaposed against Taunting's continued, arrogant publication of articles demanding the police work harder to apprehend the phantom killer, completely unaware that the authorities had successfully decoded his horrific, journalistic game. The definitive, absolute climax of the agonizing investigation arrived in June of 2008, when the forensic laboratory delivered a conclusive, irrefutable report confirming that the DNA profile extracted from Taunting perfectly, undeniably matched the seminal fluid recovered from the heavily brutalized bodies of the victims. Armed with this catastrophic, scientifically absolute evidence, heavily armed Macedonian police units executed a highly coordinated, rapid raid on Taunting's residence, forcefully apprehending the veteran journalist and immediately terminating his terrifying, decades-long masquerade of journalistic integrity. The sudden, incredibly dramatic arrest of one of the nation's most prominent, highly visible crime reporters sent a paralyzing, unprecedented shockwave of absolute disbelief and profound horror throughout the entire country, completely dominating the very newspapers he had utilized to construct his dark mythology. His colleagues in the National Press Corps were utterly devastated and deeply traumatized, struggling to comprehend how the quiet, seemingly dedicated professional they had shared office space with was simultaneously operating as a methodical, deeply sadistic serial killer. The grieving families of the victims, who had previously welcomed Taunting into their homes and tearfully shared their profound, unimaginable agony with him, were violently forced to confront the monstrous, sickening reality that they had been actively comforting the exact architect of their destruction. Stripped of his authoritative press badge, his widely respected public platform, and his carefully curated image of the objective truth seeker, Taunting was instantly reduced to a cornered, deeply exposed predator sitting in a bleak police interrogation room, utterly incapable of utilizing his writing skills to explain away the undeniable biological evidence. When presented with the overwhelming mountain of forensic data and the highly detailed analysis of his own incriminating articles, the arrogant, highly communicative journalist suddenly, completely lost his voice, aggressively maintaining a stoic, uncooperative silence that starkly contrasted his previously prolific output. The terrifying realization that the Kit Evo monster had been hiding in absolute plain sight, actively manipulating the public narrative and profiting off the immense tragedy he personally generated, fundamentally shattered the local community's inherent trust in their neighbors and the press. The meticulously constructed, deeply deceptive architecture of his dual life completely collapsed under the harsh, unforgiving glare of modern forensic science, proving definitively that his supreme, narcissistic belief in his own intellectual superiority was the exact mechanism that secured his inevitable downfall. The highly anticipated, deeply sensationalized criminal trial that was expected to expose the full, horrifying psychological depths of the Macedonian journalist ultimately never materialized, abruptly terminated by the killer's final, desperate act of supreme cowardice and control. Just days after his shocking arrest, while being held in a heavily guarded cell at the investigative prison in Tetovo, Vlado Taunting was discovered dead by correctional officers, having utilized a remarkably grim, primitive method to commit suicide by forcibly drowning himself in a shallow plastic bucket of water. This sudden, entirely unexpected death permanently deprived the grieving families of the victims, the local community, and the national authorities of the formal, legal justice and the definitive psychological answers they so desperately required to begin the agonizing process of healing. The official police investigation was fundamentally forced to close, leaving behind a dark, profoundly disturbing legacy of a man who successfully weaponized the Fourth Estate to achieve both the violent satisfaction of murder and the deep, narcissistic thrill of global notoriety. The tragic, unresolved nature of the Kit Evo murders permanently spurred the municipality, serving as a chilling, definitive case study for global behavioral analysts regarding the extreme, lethal dangers posed by communicative offenders who actively integrate themselves into the investigative apparatus. Taunting's catastrophic, entirely selfish decision to escape the legal consequences of his atrocities ensured that his true, underlying motivations remained permanently locked away in the impenetrable silence of his grave, completely erasing the voice he once utilized to terrorize a nation. The fundamental horror of a predator holding the pen and openly dictating the terms of his own manhunt represents the absolute zenith of serial killer arrogance, perfectly demonstrating how an insatiable need for public acknowledgement frequently overrides basic self-preservation. Yet, the calculated, deeply intricate manipulation of the public and the police through the written word is not an isolated phenomenon confined to Eastern Europe, but a terrifying tactic that was masterfully perfected decades earlier in the United States. Across the globe, another highly communicative, deeply arrogant phantom utilized complex, incredibly sophisticated cryptographic puzzles and heavily taunting letters to paralyze the state of California, establishing an enduring, unsolved mystery that continues to haunt the annals of modern criminology. In the late 1960s, the San Francisco Bay Area was widely celebrated as the global epicenter of a massive cultural revolution, heavily defined by the vibrant counterculture movement, the pursuit of artistic freedom, and a pervasive atmosphere of societal rebellion. Amidst this sprawling, deeply optimistic environment, the surrounding suburban communities of Vallejo and Benicia offered a stark contrast, representing quiet, working-class municipalities where teenagers routinely sought out the privacy of secluded lovers' lanes along the rural outskirts of the city. These isolated, heavily wooded areas, completely devoid of streetlights and regular police patrols, provided young couples with temporary sanctuary, entirely insulated from the turbulent political protests and social unrest dominating the urban centers, just a few miles away. The fundamental illusion of safety in these quiet, rural outposts was violently, irrevocably shattered on a freezing night in December 1968, when high school students David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were brutally executed while parked on the desolate gravel shoulder of Lake Herman Road. The sheer, unprovoked savagery of the attack, characterized by a rapid volley of gunfire directed into their vehicle and the subsequent, merciless pursuit of the fleeing teenage girl, completely baffled the local authorities, who could find absolutely no traditional motive for the slaughter. This horrific incident was initially classified as a tragic, isolated anomaly, perhaps a localized dispute or a random act of transient violence, rather than the opening salvo of a highly coordinated, deeply psychological campaign of regional terror. However, just 6 months later, the invisible predator struck again with terrifying precision on the 4th of July weekend, violently ambushing Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau in the parking lot of Blue Rock Springs Park, another popular, secluded gathering spot for local youth. Following this second vicious attack, a mysterious mail caller contacted the Vallejo Police Department dispatch directly from a local payphone. Chillingly taking credit for the double shooting in a flat, monotone voice and simultaneously claiming responsibility for the unsolved Lake Herman Road murders from the previous year. The local detectives were suddenly forced to confront the terrifying reality that they were dealing with a highly organized, heavily armed serial offender who operated without any geographical loyalty, entirely motivated by the chaotic thrill of the kill and an emerging, insatiable desire to openly mock the investigative apparatus. This initial, cryptic telephone call marked the birth of a terrifying new dynamic in American law enforcement, setting the stage for a prolonged, unprecedented period of psychological warfare that would systematically paralyze the entire state of California. The trajectory of these brutal, seemingly unconnected murders shifted irrevocably in the late summer of 1969, transitioning from a localized, desperate police manhunt into a highly publicized, deeply sophisticated media spectacle when the killer actively formalized his relationship with the press. In an unprecedented, highly coordinated maneuver designed to maximize regional panic, the elusive predator simultaneously mailed 3 nearly identical, handwritten letters to the editorial boards of the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Within these rambling, deeply arrogant correspondences, the writer aggressively demanded that his letters be published on the front pages of each respective newspaper, explicitly threatening to embark on a massive, indiscriminate weekend killing spree if his strict editorial demands were completely ignored by the publishers. Furthermore, each individual envelope contained exactly 1/3 of a highly complex, meticulously constructed 408 symbol cryptogram, initiating a terrifying, high-stakes public puzzle that the killer arrogantly claimed contained his true, legal identity. It was within this specific batch of terrifying communications that the murderer officially christened himself, signing his letters with a distinct, crossed circle symbol and adopting the chilling moniker of the Zodiac, instantly transforming himself into a mythological figure of urban terror. The massive law enforcement agencies across the Bay Area, severely lacking modern cryptographic resources, were deeply humiliated when a local high school teacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Harden, successfully deciphered the complex code in their living room over a single weekend. The fully translated cipher completely failed to reveal the killer's actual name, instead providing a dark, deeply disturbed manifesto detailing his supreme enjoyment of the hunt and his sociopathic belief that he was actively collecting human slaves to serve him in the afterlife. This successful manipulation of the media fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the investigation, proving that the Zodiac was not merely a disorganized thug, but a highly intelligent, intensely narcissistic predator who viewed the police, the press, and the public as disposable pawns in his grand, theatrical game. By actively forcing the major newspapers to serve as his personal, highly visible bulletin boards, he successfully weaponized the intense fear of the civilian population, ensuring that his cryptic threats dominated the daily consciousness of millions of residents. The killer had successfully elevated himself from a shadowy phantom to a highly communicative, omnipresent domestic terrorist, establishing a dark, enduring blueprint for modern, ego-driven criminals who desperately crave the validation of widespread, televised panic. As the suffocating atmosphere of paranoia descended upon the entire region, the killer aggressively escalated his violent campaign, deliberately altering his established methodologies to prove his absolute unpredictability and supreme operational dominance over the scrambling law enforcement agencies. In late September of 1969, he brazenly struck in broad daylight at Lake Berryessa, wearing a terrifying, meticulously crafted executioner's hood emblazoned with his signature crossed circle symbol, where he violently stabbed Cecilia Ann Shepard and Brian Hartnell in a highly prolonged, deeply sadistic attack. This highly theatrical, incredibly risky daytime assault demonstrated a profound, terrifying evolution in his confidence, completely abandoning the protective cover of darkness and the sterile distance of a firearm in favor of a visceral, incredibly intimate method of slaughter. Just 2 weeks later, the Zodiac completely shattered the perceived safety of the urban environment by ruthlessly executing a young cab driver named Paul Stein with a single gunshot to the head directly in the affluent, densely populated neighborhood of Presidio Heights in San Francisco. This sudden, catastrophic shift from isolated rural lovers' lanes to the highly illuminated, heavily patrolled streets of a major metropolitan city immediately triggered a massive, heavily armed police response that completely locked down the surrounding residential blocks. Tragically, a critical, historically disastrous miscommunication within the chaotic police dispatch center mistakenly identified the fleeing suspect as a black male, inadvertently allowing two responding patrol officers to unknowingly cross paths with the actual white killer as he casually walked away from the bloody crime scene. The Zodiac effortlessly vanished into the dense, foggy canopy of the nearby Presidio forest, completely evading one of the largest, most aggressive dragnet operations in the history of the San Francisco Police Department, while hundreds of heavily armed officers frantically searched the shadows. This agonizing, incredibly narrow escape profoundly humiliated the local authorities, providing the arrogant killer with the ultimate, undeniable proof of his perceived intellectual superiority and operational invincibility against the massive apparatus of state law enforcement. The terrifying realization that a highly prolific, heavily disguised serial killer could comfortably execute a civilian in the heart of San Francisco and simply walk away completely unbothered sent an unprecedented, paralyzing wave of absolute terror rippling through the dense urban population. He had successfully demonstrated that absolutely no jurisdiction, no demographic, and no geographic location was safe from his highly organized, merciless campaign, setting the stage for the most devastating, psychologically damaging communication of his entire career. The absolute climax of this unprecedented psychological warfare materialized a few days after the Presidio Heights murder, entirely devoid of any cinematic shootouts, arriving instead within the sterile, bureaucratic confines of the San Francisco Chronicle's mailroom. The newspaper received a chilling, deeply mocking letter from the Zodiac that contained an irrefutable, completely ghastly piece of physical evidence, a blood-soaked, rectangular swatch of fabric carefully torn from the shirt of the murdered cab driver, Paul Stein. This gruesome, highly calculated inclusion definitively proved his identity, completely silencing any skeptical investigators who had previously theorized that the author of the letters was merely a deeply disturbed opportunist taking credit for crimes he did not commit. However, it was the specific, highly targeted threat contained within the text of this particular letter that completely paralyzed the entire state, fundamentally changing the daily routines of thousands of innocent families across the region. The Zodiac explicitly threatened to target a local school bus, chillingly detailing his exact, methodical plan to just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. This monstrous, entirely unpredictable threat instantly triggered absolute, widespread hysteria, forcing the heavily armed mobilization of the California Highway Patrol, who were subsequently ordered to follow morning school buses and maintain constant, visible aerial surveillance over local elementary schools. The entire Bay Area was effectively held hostage by a single piece of stationery, with deeply terrified parents refusing to send their children to school and heavily armed citizens patrolling their own suburban neighborhoods in a desperate, frantic bid for security. Alongside this paralyzing threat, the killer included a new, infinitely more complex 340 symbol cryptogram, openly mocking the desperate police departments and actively challenging the greatest cryptographic minds in the country to uncover his identity. By weaponizing the postal service to deliver physical pieces of his victims and threatening the most vulnerable segment of society, the Zodiac transcended the traditional definition of a serial killer, operating as a deeply entrenched, highly sophisticated terrorist who controlled the infrastructure of the city through sheer, unadulterated fear. This terrifying package represented the absolute zenith of his communicative arrogance, cementing his dark legacy as an untouchable phantom who successfully utilized the mass media to inflict psychological torture on a massive, unprecedented scale. Despite an unprecedented, multi-jurisdictional manhunt that consumed millions of dollars, spanned several decades, and generated thousands of highly detailed suspect files, the definitive identity of the Zodiac Killer remains completely, agonizingly shrouded in the impenetrable fog of history. Law enforcement agencies rigorously investigated numerous high-profile suspects, most notably the heavily scrutinized Arthur Leigh Allen, executing multiple highly invasive search warrants and conducting extensive, exhaustive forensic comparisons over the ensuing years. However, the rapidly advancing capabilities of modern DNA profiling, complex handwriting analysis, and highly sophisticated behavioral science consistently failed to provide the absolute, irrefutable physical link required to officially close the most infamous, highly publicized cold case in American criminal history. As the turbulent decade of the 1970s progressed, the prolific stream of highly mocking letters gradually dwindled and eventually ceased entirely, leaving a desperate, deeply frustrated police force permanently grasping at the shadows of a killer who simply vanished into obscurity. His highly complex 340 cipher remained completely unbroken for over 50 years, standing as a permanent, deeply frustrating monument to his supreme, mathematical arrogance until an international team of amateur codebreakers finally deciphered the chilling, unhelpful message in late 2020. The fundamental, deeply unsettling reality that a highly communicative, heavily active serial killer successfully dictated the absolute terms of his own massive investigation and entirely escaped legal consequence, continues to horrify and captivate the global true crime community. He successfully authored his own dark mythology, proving that a deeply narcissistic, highly intelligent predator can actively weaponize the public's inherent fascination with violence to secure a permanent, untouchable legacy within the dark annals of popular culture. The unresolved nature of the Bay Area murders represents the ultimate, catastrophic failure of the law enforcement apparatus when confronted with an ego-driven phantom who treats a massive, multi-agency manhunt as nothing more than a highly entertaining, intellectually stimulating game. Yet, the deep, psychological compulsion that drove the Zodiac to taunt the authorities is the exact same fatal arrogance that ultimately destroyed so many others who desperately sought the spotlight. As we step back from these localized horrors and analyze the broader, underlying pathology of the communicative killer, we are forced to confront the chilling, universal reality of what truly happens when the fragile ego of a monster is finally exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of justice. The insatiable ego that compels a predator to taunt the authorities frequently engineers their own destruction, leaving us to hauntingly wonder, if arrogance is the ultimate downfall of the monsters we catch, how many perfectly disciplined killers are still hiding comfortably in the silence? Thank you for exploring these dark psychological depths with me, and thank you for watching.